This is Ben Kesling, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, this is awesome. These things work out great sometimes. David Neese is joining us. Hey, David, how are you?
Good. How you doing?
Great. And he made a movie, and gosh, we had you on the show a couple of years ago. I think it's pre-COVID even. And it's called The Gift, and it's about a Medal of Honor recipient. And I don't want to steal all your thunder and everything, but I know how much you're passionate about these kind of stories and the brotherhood and the military stories of people being deployed. And when Ben was going to be on the show, I realized, hey, David should be on here too, because you have seen, and you're not a military guy, but you've seen what that unit brotherhood looks like. And I'm saying specifically brotherhood because we're talking about, Marine combat people. We're talking about Army infantry people that go out. And yeah, there might be some women around, but really what these lives look like in the moment of their deployment, but in particularly after the deployment, right? When they're done being in the military or done being deployed all the time, it looks different. And you've had a chance to really say that. So before we go too much further, just really quick, tell us about The Gift, and then talk about some of that experience. Then we're going to kick right back over to Ben.
Yeah, I just want one correction. The Navy is part of the military. I was in the Navy.
Yeah. Okay. My bad.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, The Gift is the story of Medal of Honor recipient Corporal Jason Dunham and the Marines of Kilo 37. I by chance actually sat next to Jason on a flight years ago, which made that connection with me. And long story short, became friends with his family and all his Marines for the past 18 years. And 3 years ago, we decided, it was time to tell that story. So we kicked it off, and we just wrapped it up, and now we're shopping it around and doing the festival circuit. So.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. Ben.
Yes, sir.
Coming on the show, man. I dig it. So all three of us, my apologies, David. Once you said that, I'm like, oh my gosh, he was in the Navy. I forgot about that. So
I thought you were just busting my nuts.
No. Come on, I'm in for all of it. I like when they play like all the different military hymns. I want to know why they didn't play the Space Force one. Everybody who serves is good by me. Ben, you were in the Arghandab Valley. And I've been to the Arghandab Valley. Actually, I was just up the road in Zabul when I was in. And it's so funny because you get how remote and hard these places are. We often lose sight of like, well, why didn't we win? Like, it is really hard to just walk in these valleys. And let alone, and when I explain to my friends, like, you bring a certain amount of ammo with you, right? 270 round, or however it's going to be, right? And you're going to have this ammo with you, but you can shoot that up so quick, as a unit, and there's no help coming for a long time, whether it's, you're waiting for a quick reaction force to come out. Can you explain the size and scope of what a deployment looks like if you're on the ground and you're walking out with a platoon or a squad or some kind of team?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, so I talk about an Army unit, right? That was deployed to the Arghandab in 2009 in Afghanistan. They're called Bravo Company, and one of the things that I want to bring home to people is the idea that walking from here to there, just a couple hundred yards, right? Like the space you would take to walk for a cup of coffee in the real world, right? In the civilian world, you're going over walls, through canals. Watching out for IEDs the whole time. 100 meters is a chore, right? When you're in a place like the Arghandab Valley, and I try to bring that home to people.
Yeah. What does that do to the people who are on that deployment, who are going through these obstacles? And you're talking about even like Stone Age, but more built up areas. If you're in even more remote area where it's just rocks, it's just rugged, every step has to be picked on. Like, you can find yourself in all these different environments in the same patrol.
Yeah. Well, so the book I did about Bravo Company, about these guys, it follows them through their Afghanistan. They started out as doing combat advisory stuff when they first got to country, and it was pretty boring, and they didn't have firefights, didn't have anything, and they wanted something more. And they got that halfway through their deployment. They got sent to the Arghandab, and like you said, there's all this different environment that you're walking through. But for these guys, the Arghandab, for anyone who hasn't been there, is this lush valley, right, during the summer months, where the greatest pomegranates in the world are grown. And wherever you have extraordinary agricultural lands, you have to have extraordinary ability to grow things, right, and to water those things. And undergrowth, overgrowth, canals, all those things are not great if you're a foot patrolling American infantry unit trying to take over a territory. And I bring that idea of like what it's like. Well, ID through ID, and take a day.
You were breaking up just a little bit.
All right, sorry.
Might be in your range. That's all right. So say that last little bit again. I'm going to bring David over. Hey, David.
Hey.
Ben is stuck. I'm going to kick him out of the studio, and he'll come right back, I'm sure.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah. So I get, okay. So when you talk to your guys from your movie and you interact with them and they talk about the day-to-day lives, this is a different environment, right? It's Iraq. It's
Right.
Oh wait, I think Ben is back.
Here we go.
Hey, Ben.
Sorry about
Let's
that.
see if we can. That's all right. It's all right. Wireless, right? We're slaves to wireless.
We're used to we're used to field expediency here.
Right. I also remember the day though of the tactical facts. We're like, no tactical facts today. It's raining outside. And you're like, what the hell? But it's true.
Yeah,
so we were talking. Gosh, I kind of lost my spot on where we were at with you. Oh, okay. Here's what I wanted to ask you about. So you find these guys now. How did you find this story? How did you pick this thing? I mean, you write things for a living. Why this one?
So I first found Bravo Company in 2019. It was a decade after they got back from this deployment that I talk about in the book. I found them as a newspaper reporter because I was writing about this reunion they were doing called Operation Resiliency, where they brought together the entire unit to try to see if they could stanch some of the issues that were happening 10 years after deployment. Suicide issues. They lost a couple men to suicide, some suicidal ideations, etc. So the VA and a group called the Independence Fund brought these men together as a group to see if treating them as a unit, as a team, would break through. I mean, sometimes when we're going through post-deployment, we go through it as individuals, right? We lose that unit, and they brought them together for this unit. And it was some of these guys. Like one guy talked about Jordan. He was worried about coming to the reunion because he was down on hard times. He didn't have any cash. He couldn't even buy somebody a beer, but his dad slipped him like $100 for folding money so he could come to this reunion. And when he got there, he felt the sort of the arms of his brothers back around him. That's how I found them. And then once I wrote that, I realized that I was already talking to this company of soldiers. They'd already let me into their, let me in. So there was much more to write. So I wrote about their pre-deployment, their deployment, and then that 10 years of reckoning with that, right? As veterans, as fathers, as sons, and I talked about that. That's how I got introduced. Right,
and then the link for the book is down below, Ben. There, it says Bravo Company. Oh, you know what? That's the YouTube link. Let me get the right show link in there.
No problem. And one thing, writing about these guys, a lot of military books, they show you the deployment, or they show you the veteran perspective, very rarely the veteran perspective, but mostly deployment stuff. I wanted to have a continuity of a picture of what it is like to return from combat. So I burrow into their story of that harrowing time walking through Afghanistan. I document the deaths of some of the members of they had 3 KIA. They had about a dozen amputees and almost a 50% Purple Heart rate by the time they came home. And I talk about all that in the book. And then when they come home, I talk about that return home and what it's like for, there's one guy, Sergeant Alex Harghandab, and he lost both of his legs in the Arghandab Valley after this deployment. But I talk about guys like him because he's almost fortunate in that he has the visible wounds of war. You look at him and this guy's been to war, and everybody gives him his due respect. But there's other guys who they have either mental or mental traumas or physical traumas you can't see, and it's very hard for men and women when they return from combat to at one point, one man, Alan Thomas, one of his majors, when he's going through Wounded Warrior Battalion, because he had a ball bearing went through his chest from a suicide bomb, and one of the majors says, "Man, you need to stop being a pussy." Because he doesn't have the visible wounds of war that some of these guys who have lost legs have, and that's very hard to cope with that. So there's some of the stories I tell.
Yeah, boy, what an asshole that major was. I want to punch him in his fucking mouth right now. And he doesn't know what he's talking about. Clearly didn't spend enough time outside the wire getting shot at. And this is your story and what you're talking about. Everyone definitely get the book. It's right down below. Just get the book, get one for a friend, do a buddy read, and it's going to be awesome. David, when you hear him talk about this, you've done a similar thing with your storytelling. I'm going to shut up and let you fill the holes in there.
Yeah, I could totally, and I listened to one of the podcasts you've done on the past, Ben, and the thing that really I could relate to was how you talked about, you want people to, after reading your book, you want people like civilians to understand what it's like for anyone to go to war and come home from war. Early on, when I started, I literally started this project in 2004. I started shooting stuff back then. And there were a group of Kilo Marines who were on scene at the time of the grenade attack. And I interviewed them and I sat them down. And I was just coming off a doc I did on a high school teacher I had who was a Marine at Quezon. So it almost prepared me for what would lie ahead, because I had experience of sitting down with veterans who had been through some horrific stuff at Quezon. And, 30 plus years later, it was emotional for them. And so that really prepared me for these guys. So when I sat these guys down, I could see what the problems were. The one guy in particular, I was worried about him going home, back to Oklahoma. I tried to get him to, re-enlist and still be around that unit, right? Because I was worried if he went home alone, something was going to happen. And long story short, something did happen. He's fine now. He pulled out of it, but for a long time he was in a bad place. And I can relate to everything you're saying. Like you said, how they let you in, and these guys let me in. I mean, it's been 18 years. When I sat them down for interviews, it was 16 years. And, one guy in particular said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "Yeah." He's like, "I'm going to give it to you all of it to you, because I trust you." So I think it's very important for civilians to read your book, or to watch a story like I did. And I use an example sometimes when I tell people this. A lot of times in the military, and it's happened to me. I didn't even go to war, but you're in the airport in uniform, and somebody walks up to you, shakes your hand, "Thank you for your service." And I don't really think they understand what those words mean, and I don't blame them. I think they just don't know what else to say. They think they're doing something good, and it's nice, but they don't truly understand what those words mean. And I think after reading a book like yours or watching The Gift, I hope that people will take something from that. So the next time they are in an airport and walking up to a young Marine or soldier, airman, sailor, they know what those words mean. So yeah, I can completely relate to what you're talking about and what you wrote in your book.
Thank you. Yeah, and I mean I sort of had a couple different tasks with writing this. Is I wanted to make the story of war and return accessible to the civilian population, right? So that folks who don't know anything about the military can pick this book up and read it. There's, it's not jargon filled. It's not filled with acronyms. And when there are acronyms, they're used for a purpose. So it's not something that's going to scare off somebody who doesn't know this world, because it's our job, right? It's our job as veterans and as the military to, we're citizen soldiers, and it's our job to make sure that the rest of the population understands what it is that they are sending young men and women to do, and to try to keep this bifurcated system, or the military caste it's a jerk move on our part. We need to try to welcome civilians into the conversation. I think that this book does that, but it also, at the same time, I hope, can be a way for men and women who have served from whatever generation, but especially the Iraq and Afghanistan generation, to better understand their own deployment and the things that they went through. And one of the things I do in the book is, as I'm talking about this company, right? So Bravo Company is just, just a little over 100 guys, right? Very small unit. But to understand what they were doing, I took it all the way up to the Pentagon and the White House to figure out how they got deployed, where they got deployed, and what that mission was. And I think that's something else that doesn't get, like, a lot of high-level history books will talk about the strategic aims of the war and all that. A lot of memoirs will talk about what one fire team or one squad saw. But I wanted to connect those threads to be like, okay, here's what a company was seeing on the ground, but here is how they got there. Here are the general president who made the sort of chessboard moves that got a company into a valley, walking through canals filled with filth and animal shit and everything else, right? And it's important to connect those dots from Washington, D.C. to the Arghandab Valley.
Let me connect some more dots too, because what you're talking about is in the vein of what I talk about. When you deploy a infantry unit, right, or company in this case, you have to train them to be able to withstand whatever it is they're going to face. But you don't know what they're going to face because Afghanistan is an incredibly complex place. And by the way, half of their tour, they're not doing any of that stuff. And they're absolutely not trained at all to do that. Everybody will say that they are. But the reality is if you look at the amount of training time you put into sending a specific bullet downrange to hit a specific target and then deal with all the repercussions that come from those bullets go back and forth, it's 99% of the training is focused on that action. And so then we're asking these guys to, one, do something that they're not supposed to be doing, because they're infantry guys versus doing like advisor work, right? And we just act like it's a simple thing. So when we see these struggles, you think about the folks at the very top, the strategic, theoretic, policy level, they can't comprehend the complexity of the mission. And most of these people, like your major you're talking about, would shit their pants to have to go out or blow their brains out to go out and do this, either to not do their job or to do their job, and it's a particularly contested place. This stuff it's terrifying to know. You're constantly, when you walk on a patrol like that, or you're on a compound in Iraq where you get shelled a lot, you're thinking every step, and I'm not exaggerating, every step, where is the threat? Where do I go? How do I help? Every step, crunch, and now, and never, ever stops. And so someone like Corporal Dunham in David's case, or the guys at Bravo Company, these guys are constantly looking. Corporal Dunham has a second and a half to decide to take his helmet off, throw it over a grenade, and dive on it. I mean, that's it. And if he doesn't do it, all kinds of people die around him, right? And so that stress is just living in you. It changes how your body responds to threats, to going to a store. And I mean, I suffer from this, right? I was at my therapist the other day, yesterday actually, and we were talking about these things, these responses that are built in, through training and through chemistry within your body. And you don't know this going in. You're just like, yeah, I'll handle it just fine. But you don't realize, like most of us don't handle it just fine.
Well, and I mean, one of the anecdotes I have is when the men of Bravo Company come back and they're standing in formation at Bragg, right? Some jerk off at the division headquarters uncorks one of those ceremonial cannons for something that they're doing. And these guys are staying in formation. They just got back from Afghanistan, and some of them hit the deck, and it's like, yeah, we're standing in the middle of United States, and Fort Bragg, nothing's going to happen. And yet that explosion causes that reaction. Right. And to talk, to go back, Pete, what you were saying about not knowing how you're going to respond to stuff and like still having that weight when you get back. Yeah. One thing that talking to these men of Bravo Company helped me to better understand about my own experience and other Marines that I served with is that it's not a universally bad thing, right? Like we have this, I call it the template for veterans or whatever, right? Veteran joins, veteran deploys, veteran sees some crazy crap or gets blown up, veteran comes home broken. That's the sort of template that we have as a society for veterans. But it's not that way, right? There are infinite shades of gray, variations on a theme in there. And the same stuff that makes these men hit the deck when they come home and hear ceremonial canon are the same things that make some of them extraordinarily good fathers and extraordinarily good husbands, because they realize they've learned the depth of humanity in ways that that most civilians, and I mean, frankly, most veterans never get to see. Right.
It also depends too on the level of where you're at. Are you young, an E3, which is like a PFC in the Army, or are you like in the case of David's story, Trent, who's the commander, right? He's a captain at the time, and he goes on to become a colonel. They have completely different abilities to deal with these things because of what their mission is. David, when you look at the guys from Corporal Dunham's company, how have they held up? What I mean, you've talked to these guys in depth, camera in front of their face, low lighting to make this emotional, so you're feeling it. How are they responding all these years later?
A lot of them had talk about the time to decompress. I mean, they're still dealing with it. It's something that's going to be with them forever. They're just more educated now and more aware of it. And even though Trent was a captain back then and retired as a lieutenant colonel, he still has his moments, and he loved, and talking about Ben going to this reunion, we had one in this last September, a year ago, and it was at the Dunham's house, and the whole company came together, Kilo Company, and it was the most therapeutic, as well as scary moment for them, right? Because a lot of them were afraid to see the parents, because a lot of them will tell you, what do I say? Yeah. What do I say? Especially Billy and Kelly, who were right next to him when that grenade went off. Kelly in particular. What do I say to the parents of a guy who gave his life for mine? So, and this is a constant thing they're constantly thinking about. And, and talking to a lot of Vietnam vets, Quezon Marines, and they'll tell you, it'll never go away. You just kind of have to learn how to manage it, and take what you can from that. And it's a continual learning process.
And I mean, David, how were Jason's parents? What role play in that therapeutic, in the therapeutic response for the men who served with Jason?
What role did his parents play?
I know. Yeah, I mean, so for like Bravo Company guys, to one of the top ranking enlisted guy who got out as a command sergeant major. His name's Mac, hard ass. I mean, just your typical SNCO, right? And he told me that he never really found himself scared of anything until he had to face the parents of a soldier who died under his watch, and he felt responsibility for that. And that parents were able to unlock the ability for him to, accept that it was okay to move on. How did Jason's parents fill that role for that unit?
Yeah, they played a very integral part in getting these guys. I mean, it was their idea to have that reunion. And Dan Dunham gave a speech, and you can see it in the doc at the end. There's 75 Marines standing in the driveway, and both him and Deb basically tell them, we've waited 17 years to have as many of you here as possible. And he basically told them, my son did what he wanted to do that day. And I know my son would want all of you to, move on with your lives and not hold on to this. None of you have done anything wrong. We don't blame you. We love each and every one of you like you're our sons, And I mean, it was a very moving moment. And for years they've said this, to any of those Marines that they had met. And one guy in particular told me on camera that last year I text Deb on Mother's Day and wished her a happy Mother's Day, and she texted me back and said, I don't blame you, and you shouldn't blame yourself. I love you, and it was very emotional for him. He broke down, but it was good because they needed to hear that, because a lot of them have this guilt. Why wasn't I there Why wasn't I there that day? Why was I down the street? I was the point man. Jason shouldn't have had to go up to that insurgent in the truck. It should have been me, you know? And the Dunhams have played an important role in trying to get them to understand that, you know, it's fate. Everything that happens is out of your control, and it's okay. You know, it's okay to live your life and be happy and move on. So it was a very therapeutic thing, which I'm sure the reunion that Bravo had was probably the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, and for Bravo Company, it's one thing I've learned by writing their story, and this comes through in the book, is you never know what action you're going to take that can have a life-changing positive effect on the troops with whom you served, or troops with whom your son or your daughter served. What you can say to them that will unlock something that maybe they've been carrying around for a decade, right? And they don't even know they're carrying it. Because coming to understand the feelings you have of survivor's guilt, that's the kind of common terminology, but that doesn't give enough of a. I don't think that doesn't explain it, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're always talking about with veterans. Oh, you can drop all that. That's behind you. You can forget about it. And if you've done something that you regret, you can forgive yourself. You need to work to forgive yourself. And I think that does a disservice to veterans. And talking to Bravo Company, especially the leadership, is for getting that forgiveness is never going to happen. Like if a senior leader or a squad member standing next to you did something that contributed to injury, to harm, to death, that should not ultimately be forgiven, but it should be understood, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because
exactly.
if you try to forgive it, it just sort of erases it and gets rid of it. But there are things that we've done while deployed that we should never be forgiven for or forgive ourselves for, but we should understand the context in which they happened.
Yeah.
And by understanding it, we can come to a resolution, right? And I think that that's something I've learned through talking with Bravo Company guys.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these Kilo guys, you hit on a good point there. A lot of them have said, it's taken me, 17 years to realize Jason wanted to do that. They finally come to terms with that, and that they're okay. I mean, they're not okay, but they understand it better. I mean, come on, when you're 19 and you're squad leader, and for some of them, close friend takes a grenade for you. I mean, that's a lot of shit to carry on your shoulders for a 19-year-old kid, and finally surface in your late 30s, early 40s and start dealing with it then.
Right. Yeah. And that's an aspect of experience. I know it's trauma, but I sometimes I hate to call it that, because it makes it that comes with sort of stereotypical understanding of that. I want to say it's experience, right? Because trauma, there's good and bad trauma. There's it's all bad trauma, but there are ways in which it can help us grow in purposeful ways, and there are ways in which it breaks us down. But there are also ways in which we carry it and don't understand that it's even there. And by being around our brothers and our sisters, right, like who are there with us, and that's the whole with the Bravo Company reunion that I covered. These guys come together, and they feel a renewed sense of purpose with coming together and with being able to open up to each other and understand. Before the reunion started, some of the senior leaders, they were worried about coming back, because they're worried about confronting these PFCs who are now 10 years down the road. And what's that conversation going to be like with no mediation of uniform and no mediation of that decorum? How do you have those conversations about combat? And I was just talking with one of the Bravo Company guys who said before, when they found out there was going to be a reunion, he got in touch with a couple of people and said, "Look, I didn't like you when I was in. I've gotten over it. I'm not gonna punch you in the face, but I just want you to know I don't like you, man, and we're gonna have to work through that." And they worked through this at the reunion, because they were being honest with each other in ways that they could only be with their fellow brethren.
Right.
When you talk about, like, some of my best friends are people I've been in the mouth, right? I mean, that you get into these conflicts and you grow from it. And we understand that. We understand that trigger, and we're like, yeah, you know what? We used to not get along, but now we're best friends. We love each other, but we struggle with these other emotional aspects, and I can't tell you why that's the case. And I know you guys have both heard this statement said: "I would rather be in combat than deal with X," and X should be a walk in the park compared to combat, right? And I know I feel the same way. I'm like, I'd rather go on a combat patrol than have to deal with this depression and PTSD and all these other things. I know you guys have stories about this. So Ben, just tell us some about what that looks like from your point of view.
Well, I'm gonna take your question and go a little bit off kilter with it, because I have a section where I talk. You say I'd rather be in combat than doing X, and I have a section where I talk about what it's like for the people back home, right? Like for that spouse that is back home with the kids, right? Like deployment is a weird thing. Temporally, right? Like what it does to time and reality. Like you go on a deployment, you're gone for 7 months, a year, and you come home and you want things to be the way they were the day you left. But everybody back home has kept doing what they're doing. And I talk about for spouses, there's this pressure that you don't have when you're deploying. You just have the mission at hand, and yeah, you might step on an IED. That's pretty shitty, but you're not having to deal with the ins and outs of getting kids to school and getting lunches and doing all that by yourself. And spouses have to do that. And I think that's an amazing aspect of this that a lot of times gets papered over. We don't think about that. I mean, talk about how spouses, when someone's deployed, not only are they dealing with all that, but they're waiting for that, the potential inevitability of that government-owned sedan to pull up in front of the house, and those folks in their freshly pressed uniforms to walk up to the front door. And there's just as the people who are deployed have the stress of every day might be the day you step on an IED. For the folks back home, every day, this moment right now might be the time when that sedan might pull up to say that your little one has been lost in combat. So I think I sort of punted on your question, but I think it's important to think about all the ways in which deployment and combat pressures affect troops and those who are closest to them. There's ripple on or whatever and third order effects for all this.
The other thing, when people will say to me, "Hey, thank you for your service," yeah, I appreciate it, right? You're doing your job to say those words and everything. But you gotta thank my daughter for the sacrifice of not having a dad around. I mean, she didn't sign up for that, and because I had to go do what I had to go do, goodness gracious, she pays this cost. And I knew my kid and growing up, but I wasn't there every day.
Yeah, and I also, I mean, one of the things I write about is that spouses, and I really wanted to include this because it's something I've talked to people about and seen. Spouses, they learn to live with a departed spouse, right? Yeah. Like you're gone, and there's this constant stress that you might be that the spouse might be killed in combat, and maybe they don't know it, but they learn to live with that pent up, bottled trauma of I call it like almost like Schrodinger's cat, right? Like you never know if your loved one is safe or if they're injured at any time unless you're on the phone with them. And how often does that happen? Not very often. And I think that's a very important aspect of this whole story.
David, rather be in combat than X.
Yeah, we interviewed a lot of the wives. I'll get to that in a second. But one thing I thought about was Kelly Miller, and he has said to me on a couple of occasions, I wish I had been the one, because it's much easier to be, the hero than it is to be the guy who's still walking around having to constantly carry that, guilt of being a survivor, and we talk about that a lot in the doc. And Trent Gibson in particular was giving a speech in 2007 at the museum during Medal of Honor weekend, and he gave some of those words to those two, Kelly Miller and Bill Hampton, and he talks about these certain words I needed to give these guys to learn about how to be a survivor, and getting back to the families, wives, kids, parents, Deb and Dan have talked about that all the time. It's, Dan says it is you live in fear. He's like, a fear I've never known, every day. And that's just while they're on deployment. And then you go back to when they return, especially the one guy in particular, Mark Dean, his wife at the time was dealing with a lot, watching him go through these things, these different scenarios and addiction and just all that bad stuff, and it affects them and it affects the kids. I was recently at a Quezon Veterans Reunion in Reno this past weekend, and they had a seminar and they're talking about that, how, this is transferred to the wives, this is transferred to the kids,
right.
and people also have to remember that.
Yeah. It's it's not easy. It's fucking hard. It's easy to stand there and be like, I'm a badass. Nothing scares me. Like, yeah, can you stand in front of your spouse and deal with the things that she deals with or he deals with if it's a female deployed soldier and a husband or whatever? I mean, that, the things that they have to swallow and hold on to and hold the house together, do we have the courage to accept that's hard for them and damaging? I don't know. Hey, you guys both have basically adopted these units, right? Bravo and Kilo Company. And Ben, when you look forward, you're looking at David 20 years later, like, hey, I'm still working on this project. We're nowhere near done. This is going to be a long-term thing for him. And it seems like it might be the rest of his life. Certainly Corporal Dunham's parents are going to own the Kilo Company for a long time. And so it makes me wonder, when I look even further ahead, that the guys that are left from the USS Indy sinking, that get together, and their sons and now their grandsons are part of this thing. They're not escaping that, right? We have there's only a couple of the Indy guys left, but one of them is from my hometown, and the beat goes on and the mission continues. What is have you thought about that? Like, how 70 years from now you might still be dealing with this as an ancient old man?
Well, I mean, I tried my best not to write this book. So let me explain how. I wrote the newspaper story, and then I was contacted by my publisher, who became my publisher, and said, "Hey, there's a story here," and I did not think that I could do the story justice, so I tried to run away from it. But somehow, some way, like fate or whatever it is, intervened, and I relented and said, "Okay, I'll write this." And then I knew I had to try to do these men justice. And I didn't adopt them so much as they adopted me, or not adopted me, but allowed me to come in. It's one of the things about writing a third person story of war. Veterans, every veteran out there thinks their story is the one that needs to be told, right? Oh man, I had this coolest deployment or the craziest deployment or whatever. I want to tell my story. And that's a big failing of a lot of war books, is that they just it's just a glorified like war story that you tell down at the VFW or something. By me telling a story about another unit and keeping myself out of it, that's, I think, one of the things that makes the book Bravo Company so powerful. Is I don't try to make it a story about my time or tell old war stories. I write about them. And as far as you're saying, this burden that you assume when you start telling someone's story is so very true. And I deal with that in a different way in the book, which is, I talk about, rather than the burden of a storyteller, like trying to keep up with it, is the burden of a leader, right? That goes into combat with men or women. I say at one point that, so the captain on this deployment, Adam Armstrong, has been, he's been a steadfast presence in these men's life. Even as he's moved up, he's still in the Army. He's a lieutenant colonel now and a battalion commander, but he still contacts and keeps in touch with these men that are now long out of the military. It's a testament to his character and his courage that he's able to do this. Because I say, at West Point, where Adam Armstrong went, at West Point, we do our best to teach people how to be in combat, how to lead troops, how to effectively maneuver and do all that. But what you can't ever teach is, and I don't, they don't teach it, and I don't think you can teach it, is this burden that you assume, this lifelong debt to the men and women with whom you serve, to be there as their leader, as their brother, long after the colors are cased and you come home and put on a suit rather than a uniform. And Adam Armstrong, the captain of this book, I talk about him throughout, and him learning to shoulder this weight, and it's really incredible that he's able to do so. And I think that's the thing that I want to talk about is the way that people who have served with each other, they incur that debt, whether they know it or not. And sometimes when we refuse to shoulder that, we refuse to pay that debt or shoulder that burden, we forget that we are our brother's keepers, and to them and to us.
There's so many parallels to what you're saying with, the guy in my story, their story, I should say, Trent Gibson, who retired as a lieutenant colonel. There's so many parallels. I can totally understand what you're saying. I mean, I've seen it. I've been witness to it. Been to the reunions, and it's just, and he's just a beloved leader, right? He was their captain. I mean, he walked into that room at the reunion, and it was just like everyone gravitated to him, and they still do. They saw him coming up the Dunham's driveway. Kilo 6 is here. Boom. And you're right. You don't have to
have that, right? Like there's nothing in the civilian world that's making you stand up and salute, right? Like that is showing an action. I mean, that's showing leadership distilled in a way that, that West Point and Annapolis and every OCS out there would pay good money to put into a bottle, right? Like that's because when you're out, man, I don't have to salute shit, but yeah. I choose to because I respect you, and you've earned that. That's incredible that you talk about that.
And you hear him, calling him sir still,
right?
It's like, how you doing, sir? The guy's 40 years old. It's a beautiful thing to watch. It's a beautiful thing.
We're talking with author Ben Kesling, and his book, Company, it's Bravo Company. It's about these guys that go to the Arghandab Valley, and they find themselves in a real life combat situation, but the fight continues as they go home, and that's why we're talking about all these things. You guys should definitely get the book. Here's the link for the book, and look. You get to pick a lot of different things you get to do in your life, and a lot of different books you read. I think these books that come from a place where these two men, David and Ben, they're going to own part of these companies. They're going to have to go back out, and they just talked about the commanders, but they're going to be part of this story because, when the movie officially drops for David, there's going to be more. He's going to have to make himself stop recording things and stop telling the story. But the story continues, and the same thing is true for Ben. It's like these guys are going to continue to do things, and as people from my era of war, as we get older and we get saltier and we start wearing our Afghanistan, veteran hat and everything, you become a little more distant from the young people, right? And you can here's how it is, kid. But, it's hard to even manage that. Like you have this responsibility. It's just incredible how long these stories are and how varied and how tragic they are in so many cases.
Well, and I mean, so my book came out on November 1st, right? So this week, and I was in Austin for the book launch, and some of the members of Bravo Company were down there, and I did a reading, and one of the readings is about I talked to this father who one of the men in Bravo Company is blown up by an IED and dies, and I talked to his father for the book. I interviewed him pretty extensively. And the section I read was right after his son's death. He told me about what it's like to learn the news, and then to go meet the remains when they come off in Dover, and to welcome his son's body home, and then bury the last vestiges on this earth of a beloved son, right? And so I read this section, and you talk about having this continued sort of continued involvement with the company. As I read this section, there was one of the Bravo company members there who lost an arm in that explosion, who was listening to the section as I was reading it. And every time I read that section publicly, I mean, that's the section I love to read because I think it says so much. And I've read it quite a few times now, and every time I see Joey Caron, the man who died in that explosion. And even though I never met him, never knew him, I see his dad, who I talked to, and I see the Jared Lemon, who lost his arm in that explosion. And I have to take a break in the middle of reading that almost every time, because there's just so much. There's so much in there, and there will continue to be. And I just hope that I was able to. I think of my job with Bravo Company as being an interpreter. Like when we're deployed, we have Afghan interpreters or Iraqi interpreters, whatever, who help us not just translate the language, right, but to interpret the language, to interpret body language, to interpret culture, to interpret mores, to interpret everything. And I really feel that with Bravo Company, I hope I've served as an interpreter for their story, to tell it for them and for the civilians, for the generals, for the man or woman, for the guy or gal, the boy or girl who's thinking about going to that recruiting station, to understand the glory and the glory and the pity and the honor and the shame that comes with military service, and that all those things are all tied up together in a Gordian knot, right? That we can't ever cut through.
I had a question. How has spending time with all these Bravo soldiers and leadership, how has that helped you understand your own deployments as a Marine Corps officer?
So I finished the book, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't in it in any way, right? This is Bravo Company's story. It's not mine. And I had some very smart readers who were reading it, and they finished it. They were like, what the hell, man? Where are you? Like, you clearly brought experience and voice to this through your Marine Corps experience. And also, so what? Like, what'd you figure out at the end of the day? You had to come to some conclusions. You got to write an author's note. It's like, fine, I'll write an author's note. It's going at the back so that it's clearly me out of the way. We're going to talk Bravo first, and then I'll tell you what I went through. And I cover the Department of Veterans Affairs for the Wall Street Journal. I've done so for nearly a decade now, write about the Department of Veterans Affairs. And one thing that I have found across the board with veterans is when you get out of service, you have to make meaning of your life. You have to find something that, I mean, we all come from whether we were good soldiers, bad soldiers, good Marines, bad Marines, we all did it for some reason that was more than just selfishness, right? There was some sort of desire to serve. And when we get out, we need to continue that and make meaning with our lives. Mm-hmm. And I've been able to do that. When I got out, I started writing for the Wall Street Journal, and I've been able to tell veteran stories. I've been able to interview people at the Pentagon, on Capitol Hill, about why we do certain things. What are we doing with military stuff? So I've made meaning with my life, I think. I don't know. I can out on that. But talking to Bravo Company, being able to try to interpret and tell their story made that meaning for me. And I say that writing about them and talking to them did more for me, I think, than laying on a therapist's couch somewhere. Because I was able to take my experience and the weight that I maybe didn't even know that I had on my shoulders and channel that into understanding and explaining what that is for Bravo Company guys. And then, I mean, at the end of the day, people say, well, okay, what's the final thing? What did you get out of it? What's your final resolution about war? And to paraphrase, I say that if you say that you can definitively say something about war, if you think you can say, hey, this is what I've learned about it, then you're either a fool or you're full of shit, right? Like there's no way to encapsulate it and to say and to come up with a so what that really matters.
Yeah.
And the only so what we have is that we need to walk more humbly before God and our fellow man. And if that's the lesson you can learn, that you gotta redeem yourself at all times, that's the lesson that I take away from it. And I hope that people who read this, including the guys from Bravo, take away.
Yeah, and talking about reading this book is, this is how you help these stories get told. And let me just throw a weight on here. Let me talk about weight in two different ways. One, I had the DOC on. He's like one of the most important rappers from the NWA era. He wrote a lot of the raps and everything. And he said to me, I got to a certain age, my girlfriend helped me. I think it was Erica Badu, helped me realize I was carrying around all this shit that wasn't mine. And I started putting it down, right? And stuff like dealing with the combat thing, whether you're external to the unit, even with experience like both you guys have from your own service, as I have too, like you want to hold this rock. And I can hold on to this rock. I can hold on to this. It's no big deal. I don't want you guys to see me letting you down, right? But at some point you're like, this doesn't belong to me. I got to put that down. And maybe, for a guy like Trent or Scott Husing, who's a great friend of mine, who his guys still call him sir, you have these weights and you have to decide, what is going to be enough and what is just ridiculous. Like this is no longer a thing that I have to carry, because you're probably the only one carrying that rock and no one's going to get mad at you for putting it down. That's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing, and this is why I'm asking you guys to buy this book so you can understand. I just got touched on the shoulder from LinkedIn by Jeff Stewart, who was a commander of units and up to and including the Arghandab Valley over in Zabul, like I was telling you when I opened the show about, right? So he had guys out in these valleys, and it's like, how do I keep these guys alive that I can't even get a helicopter to inside of an hour? What do I do? And they lost 3 dudes on their deployment. And he's like, but I've lost 7 since.
Yeah.
So I know you were hearing the similar numbers, Ben, like, 3 on the deployment and then 7 since. And this is call it 11 years now that they've been back, right? So they're not quite losing 1 a year, but just wait as these guys hit their late 40s, early 50s, and life comes knocking hard. If it's one unit, it's all of them, because that is exactly what's going on here. And these guys are struggling, and I don't know what we do about it other than do this. And part of me doing this show is like with you guys, with your telling your story, we're telling these stories so people can understand the cost of combat, how to maybe be more empathetic towards someone who has these problems or challenges, and to also realize how far this stuff creeps out into society.
And the empathy and the understanding for this is, again, I go back to the senior enlisted on this deployment for Bravo Company in the Arghandab, Donald McAllister. He was one of these, such a hard ass, right? And the kind of guy who would be like, quit whining. Your trauma doesn't rate or something like that, right? And we always have this kind of there's also often a devolution into a pissing contest of trauma, right? Like, oh, I saw more shit than you did, or whatever, or like, okay, there's always somebody who's seen or experienced worse than you, right? Like objectively, but at the same time, we don't know what the weight of that stuff is. We don't know the burdens that are born in the hearts of our fellow man, right? Like somebody like Jason Dunham, man, like what he did. Perhaps that was something that was an easy decision for him at the end of the day, because he wanted to, like, that was him, right? Like that's what he chose to do was take that grenade. And there's some people who would never even think about doing that. And the same thing is with trauma. There's guys who can do multiple deployments. There's gals who can do multiple deployments, and all the stuff they see in combat doesn't affect them because they feel that they're professional soldiers. And you have somebody else who's like a mechanic maybe, who never expected to get into combat and gets stuck in a firefight in Iraq, one small firefight maybe, and that can come back and haunt them. So you never know what is going to affect that person next to you, and to have empathy to say, look, I'm not going to shit on your trauma, right?
Right.
Say, let's work through this together, because if I do that, I'm just bottling up all kinds of bad stuff. And Mac from Bravo Company, when he realized that he could welcome other people in for the conversation, it allowed him to drop that pack, to to recognize and have those conversations with other people allowed him to deal with his own stuff, which is so important.
I didn't let you talk for a while, David, as I thought I'd come back to you and see if you have anything to add.
I was thinking of something. It'll come back to me, but I was thinking of something while he was talking.
Well, let me say this to you, because you do these in-depth personal interviews with these guys, right? And you're looking into their soul, and that's tough in the moment, but you're also distracted by like lighting, sound, birds, and all these other things that happen, right? But then you got to edit it. You got to go right into their face and hear them breathe and hear them live that moment for real.
You know, that's hard. And the cameras and the lights, you know, that shit disappears once you start getting into the meat of it. I mean, I said most of these interviews were 4-hour interviews. You know, we'll take breaks every hour or two. And it was 8 weeks on the road. So 8 weeks and 10 interviews. And the last interview was with Trent Gibson in Lubeck, Maine. And I'm sitting out he lives out in the woods in a cabin, and I'm sitting out by his fire. He comes out, hands me a beer, and I'm just staring at the embers. And he's like, "You all right?" And I'm like, "Yeah." I said, "I just know tomorrow morning I'm going to rip back that scab again. And this is the 10th time I've done it." And for me, because I'm so close to them, it's emotional for me too. You know, I know I have to do it in order to tell the story, but at the same time, I feel like shit doing it, you know? I'm like, who the fuck am I to ask those questions to you? But, thankfully they trusted me enough where they were okay with that. But it's still on my shoulders. Like, fuck, why am I sitting here asking about this shit? You know? But it was a great experience and a great, for someone who's never been to combat to truly, and I got that from the Khe-Sanh guys, but to truly understand or try and understand, because I'll never fully understand, but I have a real good sense of it. So, yeah.
I mean, and that's something that from your project that I really appreciate what you just said, which is if we approach these conversations with people from a place of humility, right, and reverence for, not reverence for their service or something like we, need to salute them and like get them 10% off their appetizers at Applebee's because they served or something, right? But a reverence to talk to another human being and have them share something that bores down so deeply into their head and their heart and their soul, right? And to have that approach is so important, and something that that we can take away. I mean, sort of like take away for everyday life, right? It doesn't have to be talking to some veteran about some extraordinary situation. It can be talking to folks about the crap they're going through in everyday life. Like there's a takeaway for all of us in the way that you approach your craft, and it's a vocation, right? It's a holy endeavor to allow people to open up and talk and work through things in that way, and that they know that they can that you're listening to them, and that in talking to you, they're in a place that's so public, right? But yet so private and hallowed. It's one of the incredible things about talking to veterans and talking to members of the military that I've been doing for so long now, especially with these Bravo Company guys, is every time I talk to them, I turn on a tape recorder to talk to them or record the conversation, and they know that it's going into a freaking book, right? Like it's going to be out there for everybody to see. And yet, because you're treating it with reverence and you're coming at it with an honesty and an empathy, the men and women will open up to you and talk because they want to share their story, right? On a almost like complete tangent, in the Wall Street Journal, I cover a lot of tragedy that happens. It's maybe a shooting, or someone gets killed in a tragic way, and sometimes I'm the first person to talk to their next of kin, right? I will find the mom or the dad of someone who was killed in a shooting, and I'll find them and talk to them and ask them questions. And people will wonder, like, well, I mean, what's that like? Like, they don't want to talk to you. Like, and also the media shouldn't be butting in and talking to them. But I take the same approach with folks who've experienced tragedy as I do when I'm interviewing people like from Bravo Company.
Yeah.
And when you come to them to say, hey, your son or daughter just died in a tragic way. Do you want to talk about it? And of course they do. They want that. They want their son or their daughter's life to have meaning, to have memory, and to have that story be told. And as long as you're doing it with honesty and a genuineness, then the people will welcome you in. It's incredible, right?
Yeah, they know you give a shit, you know. And one of the other things that I noticed, I mean, one of the things I was worried about, and even though I knew all these guys for so long, we, you know, for years on the phone, talking, meeting up, cookouts, whatever, I was so worried about bringing all that shit up, you know, all these years later. And I was like, man, because I didn't want to do it if it was going to make things worse. You know, I'm like, well, I'm not going to do it, you know. So I was so worried about that. But I did the first interview, and one of them stood up and walked over. I gave him a hug, and he's like, thank you for that. I needed to get that shit out. And that was the same with every interview, you know. It was just, one of the wives told me, she was listening to the interview to this guy, and she pulled me aside and said, he's never told anybody about that shit, you know. That was one of the most powerful interviews, that particular Marine. My entire crew, half of them were veterans. I tried to staff it up with veterans because I wanted to know why they were there. But even the non-veterans, they all stood up after I walked over and gave the dude a hug. And my crew, and you know, the guys who have nothing to do with the military, they all walked up and hugged him, you know. And it was a beautiful thing. And I mean, I don't know, man. It was just so, you know, every one of those interviews was beautiful because they knew we gave a shit, you know, and that was the bottom line. And it wasn't some guy from fucking LA showing up with a camera crew and saying, all right, I'm going to talk about Jason Dunham now. Tell me what the fuck happened that day. You know, I've cried with these fucking guys in the interviews, you know, and I'm sure you've had the same experience while you're sitting with these guys, because they look at you and they're like, well, he gives a shit. I can tell he gives a shit. One, because he's been to war, and two, I can see it in his face. You know, he's here with me. He wants to hear my story. Did you have that experience with these guys where you could almost tell where it switches from like, okay, this is an interview for a book, and then all of a sudden you can see it happen. There's a switch, and then before you know it, the cameras aren't there, the lights aren't there, or your tape recorder isn't there.
Yeah,
and you guys are just having a conversation.
Yeah, I mean that happened quite a bit, and happened over the course of a couple of years regularly, and that's just an incredible blessing to have that. And then, as I said, I'm an interpreter of their story, so I really tried to take that. I mean, the stuff that you were just talking about of caring, right? And them sharing their story because they know that you care about it. Taking that and putting it on the page. And I think that I really do think that if you're civilian or if you're somebody who's been there, you're going to see that in Bravo Company when you read it.
And definitely everybody should be reading it. It's a fantastic book. Definitely when The Gift comes out, go see that. These things are going to move you. You're going to understand more about what the reality of these things are. You know, it's great that we have this time now where we can get granular, you know, and Trent can talk about picking up pieces of the Kevlar helmet, right? Like, and realizing what that is. And you're just like, oh my God, you know, that stuff, it doesn't get out. Jeff Stewart's story, you know, no one's told that story yet from that unit and the things that he had to do. And I'm hoping to get him on the show to talk about that, because the more we tell the story, the more we can realize the cost of these things and what it takes to go, what it takes to prepare to go, and what it takes to stay home and survive being home. And I appreciate you both for telling the story on the show. And one thing I always want to ask, and I'll just ask, this is my last question, and then we'll wrap it up and I'll give you guys a chance to say your final words. But Ben, when I'm on a lot of combat deployments, right, and a lot of patrols, and you see the reporter come out. They're the embedded reporter, and they're like going to go out there and do it. And then you read the story that they write, and you're like, what the fuck patrol were they on? And so often, and I'm not accusing you of this, so often they've come with an agenda or a story they think they're going to tell, and you're like, you are full of shit. You're full of shit. And then you look around, you're like, how many times has this happened to other units? And I'm not saying that the reporter takes a dump on the unit. I'm just saying that what they're looking for, they go to find, and they write their story like that. Help me understand that, and then we'll do final words after that. And thanks again so much for taking a couple extra minutes with me.
Yeah. No, I had embeds with me as well, right? And some were good, and some were not so good. Yeah. But one of the incredible things about writing Bravo Company is I didn't meet these guys until 10 years after they deployed. So writing about their experiences in the Arghandab is all done through extensive reporting and extensive interviews with them. And to have these men come up to me after they've read the book, which, I mean, anybody who knows when you write a book, book or a newspaper piece or do a movie about somebody, God, man, you're just like cringing when it's time for the primaries to read it and seeing what they're going to say when it comes back. And then when these guys come up to me who have read it and who were there, right? Like I wasn't there in the Arghandab with them walking around, but they come up to me and they say, man, you got that right. Like that's exactly what it felt like. That's what we experienced. That makes me feel fantastic. And I think that, to your point about reporters sometimes, not telling, be like, wow, they were on that patrol, but that's not the patrol that I recognize.
Right.
And having to do reporting, right? And having to do reporting, you can sometimes, you have to dig down into it, and you have to make sure that you are getting things correct, and you're not taking your flawed eyewitness view of things. And you're not taking a flawed eyewitness view. You're taking a deeply reported view. So that's how I tried to get it right, and I think I got it right. But yeah, it was a fantastic and onerous process.
Hey, David, any final comments?
Yeah, I could totally relate to what you were saying. Worrying, okay, what are they going to say? Reading the book, seeing the film. We did a screening at the Marine Corps Museum for Kilo and the Dunhams. There's 400 plus people there. And I was nervous. Like, what are they going to think? And as soon as it ended, Deb walked right up to me and said, I heard my son's voice for the first time in 18 years. Thank you. And she hugged me. And then Kelly Miller, who, was there when that grenade went off, he came running across the theater and just picked me up in the air and just spun me around. And he said, you nailed it. You fucking nailed it. So it's a good feeling to know that you not so much got their approval, like you did the story and you did it right. So, and that's all I give a shit about. So,
exactly, getting it right.
I don't care about what anybody else says. I care about what they say.
Yeah. Ben, anything in closing?
I really hope that my book Bravo Company, that folks, that if you're somebody who's been to combat and really can't, I don't know, you feel like you can't talk about it with somebody, or you can't explain it to mom or dad, or that person at work or whatever, I think that this is the type of book that you can hand it to them and say, this doesn't just go for Bravo Company. It goes for any veteran. That you can hand them this book and say, that's what it's like. Like this is the experience. This is the unvarnished experience. And it's not gratuitously violent for the sake of being violent. It is the objective look at the violence that occurs to the human body and the human mind in a combat zone. And I think that it can do that, but it can also help if you're a veteran who's been there to see your own story, to recognize that, because there's a universality in the specifics. As I talk about the specifics of the men who are patrolling through the Arghandab with Bravo Company, there's a universality that every grunt will recognize with that. That's my final thought.
All right, stand by. I'm going to shut this thing down. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much.